OD.live, it looks like. know. Relaxing music indeed. Yeah. Dun, 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 dun. Gonna fulfill a subscribe star video, or rather audio request. Audio by way of video, video by way of audio. Multimedia. Duerstravagaza. Alright, yeah, so let's dive right the fuck into this. I got another gracious donation from one Diendu in the video request $9 a month column. So he's gonna torture me and all of y'all with this cringe, with this lefty, just up-talking cringe I'm imagining. Got Sean Gaines, Troubles, Whiteness, in the big two DC and Marvel comics. Someone who goes by Professor Latinx, of course. Just goofy. Goofy as fuck, man. It's just insane that this even has... But anyway, it's just picking the easiest thing, like DC and Marvel, and then saying, oh yeah, the people in here are victimizing me, so give me money. We'll see what he has to say about this.
Welcome to Professor Latinx podcast, and today on this sunny day here in Columbus, Ohio, I have Sean Gaines, co-editor of Unstable Masks, Whiteness, and American Superhero Comics.
Ugh.
Sean is also PhD candidate in 20th century American literature and culture at Michigan State University. Sean.
So if you go to Michigan State University, you got shammed.
Sean, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Frederick.
Sean, this book that you co-edited with Martin Lund, who unfortunately can't be with us at this moment. I know he's across the pond, and the hour differences were a little bit difficult. But you came up with this idea. Why? Why did you and Martin come up with this idea? And, of course, dedicate a bunch of time and energy to pull it together.
Well, we thought we could grift the hell out of a bunch of really guilt-ridden white people who have a lot of money. And that's if they were going to be honest about the response, that would be the most honest response. Again, taking like one of the most visible spaces, Marvel Comics, and taking another trendy thing, whining about racism, and jamming them together. Why not? It's an easy thing to do. It's like a really, really easy thing to do.
Edited volume that really kind of interrogates whiteness.
Yeah, kind of a providential story, because it sort of came out of nowhere for both of us. Martin and I had been friends online for a while, and I was spending a few weeks in New York one summer,
New York.
I think back in 2016. So I sort of said, hey, let's meet up. We met at a coffee house, and I think after a few minutes of conversation sort of became best buddies, and we're like...
That's why you gotta go down and bully guys like this at the coffee house in Minecraft. Just prevent them from coming up with just waste of paper and pulp like this.
Together. And we kind of both immediately came to the idea of talking about what we had each seen as an important lacuna in comic studies, especially around superheroes, since both of us mostly read superhero comics, which is, there's a lot of great work going on race and ethnicity and religion in comics, but they tended not to be looking at what we saw as the problem that was creating the need to look at race, which is whiteness.
There, you hear that? Yeah, the problem is whiteness. The problem in this space, in and of itself, is whiteness. Wowzers. And I don't even know if they're going to try to tap dance around, like, trying to convince you and scramble your brain and make you think that it's not you as a white person being in the space or being represented. They're going to come up with some convoluted ridiculousness to get you to not notice that they're just literally talking about removing you from the space if you're white.
We sort of...
either physically or just through, like, force of will or, monetary or social influence.
Spent a few months, trying to figure out, okay, what would the of this be? And eventually, got a great group of contributors. The introduction, or not the introduction, but the preface yourself, and we got Noah Berlotsky, who's a somewhat well-known media commentator, to write the outgoing
Otsky media commentator
piece. And
really crappy connection, this guy.
So, Martin, for our listeners, what is the takeaway from Unstable Masks?
So the takeaway really is that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
You hear that? There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Whenever a lefty says that, like, that right there, that is usually uttered, that phraseology is usually uttered when the right or, the center or really the non-left has already conceded or, ceded ground to the left in some way. They'll always say after that, like after they get their concessions, they'll always say, well, there's still a lot of work to be done. And that means that they're not done. They're not done, just completely destroying you or undermining you. They're just not done ever.
With race and whiteness in comic studies, and not just with superheroes, but, the reason we started with superheroes is because, one, they're such a driver of the mainstream industry and obviously have moved into films and television and games and become, essentially next to Star Wars, probably the most lucrative thing there is in media.
Wow, yeah, he's just admitting lucrative. It's lucrative. It has a lot of influence. Wow, he's being somewhat transparent, I guess, but maybe unintentionally. Like he's letting a lot slip. Yeah, it's very lucrative. It's a big space. There's a lot of people in it. We can get a lot of money, influence, and power just whinging about stupid things that aren't real.
And so what we really wanted to do was highlight that whiteness is sort of the powerhouse behind the way that race is operating in comic studies, which, it's not a particularly novel comment to make. A lot of the scholars that we cite in our introduction, which frames everything, these are folks who are talking about whiteness and race in comics. But what we wanted to do was put the explicit emphasis on bringing the sort of multi-disciplinary interest in whiteness studies to comics and sort of start a
disciplinary interest into whiteness studies into comics. So they're trying to just bring, this doesn't stop at comics, right? They try to do this with almost every, they're doing this with every space. Pushing the old guard waspy dude out of any sort of subculture or hobby or any sort of endeavor of any sort. It's
conversation really that ideally can continue from here.
Because I think they view whiteness is like the guy who's actually gonna raise his hand and be like, wait a minute, you want multi-gendered pyro necrosexual what? What do you want in the comics? That sounds completely ham-fisted and stupid. You know, like the whiteness is going to be what's going to push back against the subversion. Like, you know, they're going to be the one that most likely to push back against it.
Sean, whiteness, for our listeners, especially the ones that are excited about comics, have been reading comics since, you know, the day we were born, pretty much. You know, in lots of ways, I think of, you know, kind of superheroes as materialized, you know, embodiments of our kind of wish fulfillment fantasy. And what does that mean when the superheroes are predominantly white and created by white sort of men, right? What
it means that we're badass, dude. That's what that means. And well, by the way, Stan Liebowitz, oy vey, you know.
What is the fantasy of white power in and through Americans?
So a bunch of people of a certain faction that's overrepresented in entertainment running groups like DC and Marvel, that's a manifestation of like white power fantasy, really? Stan Liebowitz, are you serious, dude?
Superheroes mean in terms of...
How do you come away with that? I mean, I don't understand how you come away with that takeaway.
Dreaming, daydreaming, and materializing those dreams. Does that make sense?
Isn't X-Men like a big allegory for World War II, and Magneto's supposed to be like Jewish, and if I'm not mistaken, isn't that like a whole thing?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, I think that it's an important question to ask because, you know, a lot of people end up reading comics or starting with comics because superheroes are this sort of exciting escape. And that's something Ramzi Fawad deals with in his book, The New Mutants, but sort of going in a different direction about queer fantasy and gendered embodied fantasy around gender.
Commie Twinkle Toad idiocy.
For us, I think whiteness really, we don't want to necessarily say that, you know, liking a white superhero or seeing yourself, you know, as a white child, you know, as, say, Superman, who's basically always white, is a problem. But what we do want to say is that this idea that the superhero is the figure of justice and strength, the savior of the community, even of humanity sometimes, that this reinforces the larger powers of structure into which both white people and people of color are born.
Systemic systems of structural, institutional. I mean, like, so one of the things, I mean, one of the things boomers can stop doing is like owning the libs, and one of the things they can start doing, well, maybe it's too late, but they need to figure out ways to get these types of people out of academia and out of HR departments. You know, it might have had to have been done like 30, 40 years ago. Again, like I was saying, it might be way the fuck too late, but that's one of the things that needed to be done, honestly, like to prevent all of this, is guys like this being able to actually walk into a university and with a straight face utter this gobbledygook, this fucking academic fucking diuretic soup, okay? The fact that he can go in there with a straight face and say that and be met with multiple straight faces, you know, in response, that's a huge fucking problem. You know, so you're a systemic problem, if you will.
You're noting that obviously, you know, if a child of color is reading comics, it might be difficult for them to see themselves in Superman. It might give them the idea that,
oh, my lens. Yeah, who gives a fuck?
You know, if there are no superheroes of color, then they aren't to be represented in the people who can save society. So that classic, you know, you can be anything you want to when you grow up doesn't really mean much to a child.
Okay, well, we should stop saying that to people anyway, because that's a really stupid lie. I mean, you could be whatever you want to be within reason, within your skill level, within your background, and within how lucky you are. Like, let's be real with people for a change. How about that?
Latinx child who's...
Latinx. Okay, that's a good time to glance at this. About 1 in 4 U.S. Hispanics have heard of Latinx, but just 3% actually use it. Young Hispanic women amongst the most likely to use the term because, of course, repeal the 19th in my, you know... I mean, no, that is a sex. That's what a sexist would say. That's what I meant. That's what a total sexist bigot would say. Women voting is totally epic. Okay. Pan-ethnic labels describing the U.S. population of people tracing their roots to Latin America and Spain have been introduced over the decades, rising and falling in popularity. So they're talking about Latinx. Or no, sorry. Hispanic and Latino. That came out in the 70s and 90s, but in like the 2010s, Latinx came out. And it's cool. They keep it real. It's used by some news and entertainment outlets, corporations, local governments, and universities to describe the nation's Hispanic population. So to me, like that's just straight up them admitting, like, yeah, the powers that be. This is how these like alien lizard people are deciding to dissect and pick apart the population. You know. So if you want to be a servant of that slice of the population, keep using terms like Latinx, I guess, and keep using people of color, and keep using multi-syllabic terms with the suffix ism, ist, or phobe to try to like morally shame people out of telling the truth. Keep doing that if you want to keep serving like lizard pod people, essentially. However, for the population it is meant to describe, only 23% of U.S. adults who self-identify as Hispanic or Latino have heard of the term Latinx, and just 3% say they even use it to describe themselves, according to a nationally representative bilingual survey of U.S. Hispanic adults conducted in December 2019 by Pew Research. Pew Research? So the emergence of Latinx coincides with a global movement to introduce gender-neutral nouns and pronouns into many languages whose grammar has traditionally used male or female constructions. Conjugate the verb, or conjugate the nouns. Yeah. So yeah, there's like genders for all the nouns, and it changes the way the verb operates in the sentence. So if you speak German or Spanish or, you know, Francais, whatever the fuck, that's something you got to deal with. So maybe a lot of this gender ideology stems out of these goofy ass, you know, these people that just, yeah, I mean, maybe they see gender as a way more important fixture in language because of this, you know? It could be. Or it could just be that they're trying to fucking subvert everything. Added to a widely used English dictionary in 2018, reflecting its greater use amongst 3% of Latinx. Yeah, okay. So I guess, I don't know, we'll come back to this in a second, but they're probably trying to popularize this sort of thing. They're saying like, oh yeah, it's not prevalent, but wouldn't it be great if it was? Probably.
Just trying to see their role models. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's great. So, okay, you and Martin talk in your introduction about a kind of at once sort of simultaneous assimilationist and separationist impulse in comics. What does that mean exactly for a kind of lay person?
I forget, are we talking about comics there, or are we talking about whiteness?
You're talking about whiteness, but yeah, I was thinking...
I forgot. How do we bulldoze all the white people? I mean, interrogate our whiteness, right.
You know, what does that mean? Like, I don't know. We could take, you know, the Captain America figure, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
or any
probably the most based superhero, I guess. I'm guessing
superhero figure, and Batman, or you know,
yeah.
And you know, what does it mean that somehow whiteness in and through comics at once kind of pushes toward assimilation of otherness, and at the same time creates the very category of
the uptalk throughout everything that he's saying. He knows he's making it up as he goes along. He's like, God, what kind of bullshit word salad can I string together so that we can continue to get funding and donors? What? Yeah, uptalk. Yeah.
Of otherness.
Yeah.
Otherness. I mean, we want people like you to be othered because you're really, really annoying, and you're also very parasitic. That's the thing.
I mean, when you look at the history of whiteness, and in fact, historians have been doing...
How does this offer any value to anyone
have been
or anything?
Doing a lot of the brunt of what we call whiteness studies. And one of the sort of key type of study that they do is to look at how did X group come to be considered white or not white. which is really a question of how did X group become empowered or disempowered based on what, sometimes arbitrary factors
merit
led them to be considered white or colored or raced or...
No, probably from Western Europe within the past 5 centuries and demonstrating some kind of, I don't know, civilized nature.
Ethnicized.
First world.
So when we talk about assimilationist, what we mean there basically is that both superheroes and whiteness play a role in establishing power. If, for example, in the early 20th century, certain Europeans who we might consider today are, quote unquote white, for example, Italians, Slavs, and Jews.
I love this one. The Italians are not white, but Jews are. Okay, this is just continued brain scrambling nonsense where they just try to get you to not, they don't want you knowing what it means to be white. They want to keep you guessing as to what that means so they can more easily confuse you and get you granting all these premises about, well, it's not real, but at the same time it's the apotheosis of evil. It's like they got to break it down before they can demonize it. It's classic cult behavior, right? Or cult tactics.
The middle 20th century, these people were considered white, but several decades before they were considered people of color. They were ethnics.
Right, so within probably even less than that. So within a generation, yeah. So it was Bants, but then within a generation, everybody was, Italians were considered white by Irishmen, who were considered white by, Germans, who were considered white by, you know what I mean? Like within a generation, I guarantee you, just Bants. Within a generation, more Bants, and then it's sort of like just light-hearted Bants.
And the term for that in the scholarship is ethnic whites. But what we see over time is that because the fear by people in charge that these ethnic whites from Europe could sort of align themselves with other oppressed classes in the U.S., especially black folks, giving them the sense of whiteness means that we don't have to worry as much about them joining with black folks because racial tension has been created by giving them whiteness.
These guys profit off of racial tension, so this is 100% projection on his part right there.
It's a sort of a similar thing when we're talking about superheroes. It's not a one-to-one correspondence, but the role of the superhero is to protect justice and establish safety in the community. And oftentimes we see this playing out along the same kind of lines that whiteness and whiteness's assimilation plays out.
Could you...
Dude, yeah, so whiteness means order, basically, and we're supposed to feel ashamed about that in general, like a white enclave or a white sort of area, predominantly, white area is going to value order and law, and if someone of a disparate faction comes across and tries to fuck with someone's property or livelihood, well, we have a system for that. Physical removal, law and order. So that he's just saying that's a white construct, and that's sort of like the superhero represents law and order and whiteness and that sort of thing, and that all of that is bad, I guess, and problematic or white supremacy. I don't know. Like, we'll get into it.
Give us, our listeners, an example of a superhero that comes to mind for you.
Batman?
Yeah, I think Osvaldo Oyola does a great job in the first chapter of the book of sort of talking about how...
Is this like Batman is a fascist, white supremacist sort of stuff? Because he's like a vigilante. He's like a Zimmerman who, like, I don't know, he's like a Zimmerman in a bat suit.
This question of the superhero and whiteness, and can the non-white character become a superhero like Captain America, who has historically been white and who, by virtue of their very name, Captain America, represents the United States.
Well, why would... but the question is, like, other than just to take over, just arbitrarily take, like they were saying, like a lucrative space over... There's no reason for someone like that to want their own Captain America, really. There's no actual reason for them to want that other than just money, influence, and power, really. There's no cultural reason for a black Captain America. He's somewhat admitting that right there, right?
Can he be a black person.
Heroism is whiteness. Cool. Yeah, exactly, Beholder. Yeah, exactly. Cool. Own it. Like they're saying, oh, these traits are white. White supremacy. So you're saying that being heroic and sticking up for your community and law and order, you're saying that's whiteness and bad and needs to be problematized or deconstructed in some way?
And
I don't.
So I think looking at Captain America is a pretty great example. Obviously, throughout the history of superhero comics, there have been other instances where creators and even fans have tried to race bend characters, to create
it's always cringe.
Black Superman in the form of a character named Steel.
I mean, dude, like a black Goku would actually. Yeah, I would accept a black Goku though. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? Black Superman though, that doesn't make any sense. Or black Batman.
And
why?
This typically doesn't work out well. Sales typically drop for a series.
Yeah.
Mostly racist readers revolt against the idea and simply say, no, we can have both.
He's giving you every reason to delight in being called that by him, except for, people getting banned off of various platforms. We all know there's a huge purge going on right now. It's a miracle that I'm even on duerst.live/duerst. Go check me out. Or if you're on DLive, check me out on Duerstreams on YouTube. But, yeah.
A white Superman and a non-white hero who is...
I mean, you want to be called, like, in a sense, you want to be called these names by people like this, in the sense, not in the sense that you know what's coming next. I mean, if they do a write-up on you, you know that your online presence is kaput, but, it's correct to be called these names by people like this, is what I'm saying.
Not Superman. But for the most part, there is this tendency to think in terms of the superhero figure always being white. We have essentially come to associate the most important superheroes over the past 70 plus years with white men.
Yep.
A lot of people will say, well, that just happens to be the case. And we want to say, well, that does happen to be the case, but there is a historical and power-based reason for why.
And there's absolutely no reason. Okay, well, if there is a power-based reason, there's absolutely zero reason why we should upend that power structure at all. Like these people have not given an actual reason as to why, if said power structure even exists, why we should be interested in upending said power structure. Like why on earth should we be interested in that?
You have a chapter in the book. Maybe you can share with the listeners a little bit of the sort of deeper work that you did in that chapter.
Yeah, so that chapter is based on Darwin Cook's DC: The New Frontier, which was a kind of...
Not our heroes are white, what nonsense. Well, most of the superheroes are white, at least from my knowledge. I mean, I'm not an expert on this subject by any stretch, but
a fun retelling of...
There's Blade. There's, what's the guy that hangs out with Cable, who's like the dimension traveler? I forgot their names.
The history of the DC universe. If you take, a kind of insider's approach to how did the Justice League come about in, 1960? What were the set of circumstances in a United States where superheroes existed that led to these superheroes sort of becoming a unit that, in the end of the New Frontier miniseries, is an agent of military imperialism. And so what I wanted to do, because I really love that comic, not only because Darwin Cook was an incredible artist, but because the comic did a lot to sort of resuscitate the stories of characters who seem somewhat minor from the perspective of like a DC Universe history.
What is he talking about? It's all up talking. I don't have any. It's like there's no conviction behind anything this dude has to say.
Characters like
in my mind,
Martian Manhunter and John Henry, aka Steel, who I end up focusing on in this chapter. And the reason I did that is because, having reread that miniseries shortly before we started this project, I realized how odd it was that the story of Martian Manhunter especially seems so central to the story that's developing over the course of the late 1950s in that miniseries, and then up into the creation of Justice League. So Martian Manhunter, he's a Martian. He comes from Mars. He's brought on Earth. His normal Martian form is terrifying to humans. This is the 1950s, so there's a lot of science fiction B movies about invaders from space. And there's great scenes where he's...
Hell yeah. So America's learning to fear aliens instead of love them, like when E.T., like, Spielberg comes around. Joking aside, E.T.'s aight.
Sort of goes to...
But it's clearly, like, it's clearly pro-immigration propaganda, but yeah, you just contrast it, there's a contrast there. Yeah, the Martian, be afraid of the Martian movies in the 1950s as opposed to embrace the Martian movies in the 80s, 90s, and today.
Movie theater and sees humans, screaming at the sight of these horrifying aliens, and he thinks, well, how do I fit in? How can I be a part of this society that I want so desperately to help? And his way of doing that is to sort of transform himself into a very nonchalant, typical white policeman and do police work. On the other hand, there's the story of John Henry, who, historically, if you're a fan of country music or African American folk tales and folk songs, you've probably heard of John Henry. There's many versions of that story. He was a freedman who was working on a railroad. The railroad boss brings in a steam-powered machine to, take over the work of the workers, meaning that the laborers would be out of work. So what John Henry does in the folktale is work harder than the machine until he beats the machine, but ultimately, because he worked so hard, he...
So is this supposed to be their idea of how a Blake superhero might actually be compelling to more than like two hipsters in San Francisco or New York? Is this supposed to be what this is? I'm not buying it.
Interestingly, in Darwin Cook's,
but I'm not really the audience for this kind of stuff.
Sort of imagine,
like, I have my Bugman sort of tendencies, but not like this. DC and Marvel is so paused, and so is Star Wars. I mean, all of that stuff is so paused and transparently like leftist propaganda just all the time. I can't stand it. At least with something like anime or video games, like, a lot of that stuff is pretty gay and everything, which is epic. Being gay is totally epic and awesome. There's nothing wrong with being gay, but most of that stuff is pretty on the gay side. So
okay, there's this black character,
but it's not like overtly pause. It's overtly gay, but
Your name's Steel, who is sort of invented in the 1990s, and he's a Superman figure. He's as powerful as Superman. But how do we integrate him into the history of the DC universe?
Anime is being infiltrated in Japan at the moment. Rest in peace, weeb. So are they injecting like stupid Western style, like critical theory propaganda into the anime now? So I can't imagine. I mean, there's a lot of creepy, cringe stuff in that genre already. Like, sheesh. And there's some gems in there. But from my experience, most anime is horrible. But the one thing it had going for it for a really long time is that it didn't have that stupid lefty crap in it. So maybe, they're probably going to get it in there next.
Figure out what his, addition to the Justice League would have looked like. And what I was interested in my paper is that Cook doesn't try to sugarcoat history. He doesn't try to say, obviously, in the 1950s, race was hard, but there were a bunch of good whites who let John Henry join the Justice League, and everything was, fine and dandy. And that's not what Cook does. He says, no, it was pretty racist. And maybe he is playing into a bit of sort of post-race, today is better. It's not something I necessarily talk about, but at least what he's saying is in the 1950s.
Instead of, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and you have to give us way more money so I can help more people.
In the 60s, race sucked, and if there was a black guy who was doing vigilante work, he was going to be killed by the KKK, and that's exactly what happened.
Yo, base!
So I wanted to juxtapose these two stories of an alien's ability to fit into society by sort of becoming the perfect policeman versus this vigilante who strikes out at racial justice but is murdered for it at the hands of white supremacy. and to show that what Cook is doing is
So this is just more propaganda. They're wedging more propaganda to make stupid, credulous morons who don't look into things continue to believe that white supremacy is like the main threat to worry about. Like it's the penultimate boogeyman that they can sort of brainwash people with.
re-envisioning the
yet another encroachment into yet another space.
history of the DC universe, but doing so in a way that pays very close attention to how whiteness assimilates Martian Manhunter and rejects
assimilate. Yeah,
Steel
that's right. Yeah, that's
John
right.
Henry,
Assimilate,
which is
bitch.
exactly sort of
Assimilate, bitch.
allegorical to the whole
that's right.
question of who can be a superhero.
Oh,
Those
that's
who assimilate,
great.
bitch.
I love that. The title Unstable Masks is an allusion to Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. With this in mind, could we take another character like Cyborg, or I don't know, you choose Wolverine or Vision?
Wolverine's
and
Canadian,
kind of
isn't he?
read them through
Dirty Canadians.
Fanonian kind of psychological sort of Fanonian conceptual space.
Ugh.
Yeah, I mean,
Such
I'm sure we
wankers, these
could, and
guys.
to be honest, psychoanalysis is not.
And again, this is over Latinx. They don't use it. Use of Latinx is not common practice, and the term's emergence has generated debate about its appropriateness in a gendered language like Spanish. Some critics point out U.S. English speakers saying it ignores the Spanish language. Yep. It just doesn't make any sense, and people aren't going to use it because it's stupid, and it's concocted by, like, bougie people of a certain, I don't know, overlord, hostile outgroup, sort of tribal affiliation, oy vey, I wonder who they could possibly be, oy gewalt. Those are the people whinging and kvetching about Latinx and telling people that we should use it. Yeah, young Hispanics, age 18 to 29, are among the most likely to have heard of the term. About half, under half. The older people don't know about it. Who are the ones actually saying it? Hispanics who identify with or lean toward the Democratic Party are more likely to have heard of the Latinx, of course. Yeah, so just under half of them, or like a quarter of them, are aware of it, but like the amount of people using it, yeah, online popularity, yeah, I mean, like, a lot of people couch this rise in social justice leftist advocacy around here. This is around when that Gamergate, admittedly, kind of cringe thing started, and then, yeah, it's been at decline ever since. But yeah, this is how they wedge it in. They insist on just like you using certain terminologies, and then before you know it, it's everywhere.
My field, so I wouldn't be comfortable doing it. But I think that
even if regular everyday people are not using it, right? Even if it has to be sort of or straight up astroturfed or faked or shoved into prominence or into like collective consciousness.
The chapters that we have, for example, like you said, there's a chapter on Vision that focuses mostly on his sort of desire to attain white masculine domesticity, and that's an interesting chapter because it tracks Vision across not just one single comic, but across multiple iterations, and shows how different creators deal with this. And there's a lot going on there in Esther's chapter around what does it mean to embody the white man at both sort of a psychological level, but at the physical level.
Yeah, strong alpha, believes in law and order, wants a good, like, at least a baseline pro-family environment. I mean, everybody in the chat already, everybody knows.
And there's also a chapter on Wolverine.
Low crime, high trust, etc.
That deals with this specifically in Frank Miller's miniseries about Wolverine going to Japan and what that sort of Orientalism, how that Orientalism plays into the concept of whiteness.
I think Sean wears a tea cozy on his head.
In labeling the book Unstable Masks, we're really trying to get at the same assimilation idea that you're talking about earlier, where whiteness has the privilege to put on the masks that it wants. but at the same time, always seems somewhat uncomfortable with itself, is always looking for more aspects to assimilate, whether it's...
So why do you put us in this uncomfortable position where you put us under a microscope like this in the first place?
You know, the awesome samurai-ness that Wolverine wants to eat up and sort of add to his, you know, superhero abilities. Not that a guy with impenetrable body that heals itself and has blades coming out of his hand, you know, necessarily needs any more skills.
Stoic, badass, strong,
and that
traits that you'll never have. Exactly.
At the same time,
you're not of the white, virile sort of.
You know, if whiteness is a mask, it's a mask that only certain people can put on at certain times. You know, and Vision is an interesting example because he's a robot. Like, ideally, he should be able to embody whatever he wants, but yet he's always failing this sort of psychosocial, failing to attain the psychosocial level of
this dude gets paid like $4,000 of taxpayer money every single time he says psychosocial
masculine success.
Or like, you know, like 501c3 nonprofit money from some corporation somewhere.
Batman, of course, right? Batman's a great example of this.
Yeah, I knew they were going to bring up Batman because I've heard leftists talk about this before. This idea that Batman is like, oh yeah, if he was a black man doing that, then he'd be immediately shot down by the police. But it's like, well, so what? He's got bulletproof gadgets, right? Are you doubting the abilities of Black Bruce Wayne? Or like, I mean, what the fuck, dude?
Exactly.
Dems are the real racists.
Yeah. And in Jeffrey Brown's chapter on Batman, he with Batman and the question of coloniality and justice, and how Batman sort of creates this corporation to extend the very idea of man across multiple nations. And how does he do it? He does it by choosing people who are going to do exactly what he wants them to do in the Middle East, in Africa, in Mexico, in France. And all of these people are people who in many ways challenge...
Wait, so is that right? But is that writing in and of itself like more lefty pandering? Like, isn't that more like, hey, look at how evil, like... So is Sean here taking like what we already know of as lefty sort of writing and pandering, and is he saying, oh, that is still reinforcing white supremacy, even though it's like further rubbing people's nose in it?
The classic ideals of American whiteness.
Is he that crazy?
Bruce Wayne represents. And yet, because Grant Morrison, who's writing Batman at the time, is thinking about, you know, this great sort of neoliberal crusade for global justice, he's ignoring the fact that justice looks different for white people and non-white people.
Right, yeah, justice to a white person is like, hey, you stand accused of X, Y, and Z, let's put you on trial, and if we have evidence to convict you, we do so, and we remove you from society. Non-white justice for the past several months appears to have been just, you failed to put the Blake fist up, so we're going to come, like, burn your domicile or business to the ground, or, you know, you happen to be in a similar general neighborhood or vicinity where a Blake career criminal was gunned down or whatever by cops, so, well, your private property or personal property is now a campfire. That seems to be the divergence in what Blake and white justice means. I mean, one is actual justice, and the other is just like savagery. I think that's the main. That's
you,
where it sort of.
You and Martin, as you mentioned at the beginning of our podcast, you know, you had this idea at a coffee shop. You launched into it. I know this was running up to the Trump election, and now here we are, kind of, you know, 2020. What if it...
So this is before COVID race war. These guys are still whinging. They have no idea. These people 10 months ago. Yeah, they barely even really know.
Anything has
happen,
changed in, I don't know, comics and sort of fandoms and comics creating that might, I don't know, maybe trouble or destabilize a little bit this sort of
Whoa.
this position of whiteness.
He just said destabilize. I mean, are they going to say subvert next? Trouble, destabilize, undo. Yeah, these are a lot of hostile tribal outgroup, tea cozy hat words. Oy vey.
Yeah, it's a great question because it's one that we've wrestled with a lot, not just in comics, but in society generally. And I think that the 2010s will probably be remembered in the history of comics as a period that first saw the attempts of fans and creators who are not white guys sort of begin to succeed.
Nobody wants to watch
and
read that.
The industry.
And well, yeah. And they're going to do it by force too, because they're just going to come in again. They're just going to come smash. They're going to spread rumors about a fake pandemic, and I mean, no, it's totally real, you guys. Yeah, everybody's dying off from this bat coof. They're going to spread rumors about that and shutdowns and fear about that, and then they're going to send Antifa through to smash your competing non-paused comic shop. I mean, that's essentially what they're...
to change, comics and...
That's what they're preparing for in this podcast.
Comics specifically, time will still have to tell because, I think there's a lot of important pushes for diversity, but the question is, what does diversity mean in a medium that is still, directing capital to this very powerful corporation that is still invested in what sells, right?
Oh, you guys are talking about the horror cinematic universe that we never got. We got the fucking DC and Marvel cinematic universes instead. I would have enjoyed if they had continued on the vein of Freddy versus Jason. If they had continued those types of movies, if they had been able to secure the rights in some way that they apparently haven't been able to, like Pinhead versus Michael or something, I would have liked that a hell of a lot more than what we've been getting with these stupid fucking, like, DC, whatever, Part 8, like Iron Man 87. Like, I don't care about that at all.
Justice and equality to, suddenly have a character become important only because, for example, in the case of Ms. Marvel.
Ask these guys why equality is good and watch them just deer in the headlights. I mean, they'll just walk away without saying anything. Or like try to, like, if you have to set a protest, they'll try to get the cops to get you physically removed, and sometimes they'll be successful.
Because she sells a lot of copies. It doesn't necessarily mean that the basic structures of power in society have changed for
systemic structures?
Muslim Americans or Arab Americans or Pakistani Americans.
They could just go home.
It means something.
There's an idea.
And I think the question of what it means diversity to have succeeded in minor ways in the industry is still one that's left unanswered because we haven't really seen the full ramifications of this larger media cycle we're in that is just obsessed with superheroes. So it's not really a great answer because I'm not sure there are many good answers, but I think we've generally seen that fans and critics and, now the increasing cohort of fans/critics who are becoming scholars, we're seeing that they're much better readers of race and gender and ethnicity and ability and all these different structures of power than they ever were.
A lot of people that are being churned out by the universities to effectively just be terrorists at this point. This is what we know. They're trying to just be like, they're trying to just innocently wedge it into like, oh, superheroes, whiteness and superheroes. But it's just one little edging toward training the next generation to be just street terrorists. And who will enforce things like mask lockdowns and stupid big tech censorship and cancel culture and all this crap.
So that's bringing sort of
all tied together,
a lot of excitement to the way that we talk about comics and about what's possible. Maybe in 20 years that will have significantly changed the industry and who makes up the industry. But,
I think trying to replace you. They're telling you right to your face right now. They're trying to replace you.
We'll have to see.
What, as we wrap this up, what's a really exciting title for you right now in comics?
That is a question I can't actually answer because I'm embarrassed to say I haven't been reading any comics that are coming out regularly for about 2 years, largely because a lot of my work has moved away from comics And so much of what I'm reading in comics are graphic novels that my kid needs, is reading for school or whatnot. So a lot of what I've also...
So yeah, the kids reading about how the whiteness of graphic novels is problematic in school now, probably earlier and earlier, younger and younger.
Been doing is reading over old things. So I'm trying to work my way through, the Tintin series and Valerian and Laureline, both French comic series.
Okay, Tintin's legit, I guess.
But
Lupin would be a lot cooler. Lupin the Third.
From what I hear, there's a lot of great stuff happening. I just don't have my finger on the pulse of that.
You're really busy too, trying to finish up your PhD. I know you also edit you're editor of a journal, among many other things that you do. What is the sort of next big project for you beyond sort of finishing this dissertation?
Well, cleaning my strap-on.
So finishing the dissertation, which is on the effect of the Korean War on American fiction in the 50s.
My boyfriend.
I'm also co-writing with Martin, the co-editor for this book, a short introduction to whiteness for MIT Press's Essential Knowledge series. So that'll be a book of roughly 35,000 words that's kind of geared toward a popular audience about, the larger questions, what we're talking about in this. What is whiteness? How do we think about it? How do we recognize it?
How do we grift off of it?
And how do we fight it?
How do we fight it? There we go.
The work that I'm doing, especially with Martin.
So how do we fight law and order? How do we fight a sense of justice and order and safety in our communities? How do we fight against that so we can just undermine the country? How can we get into every single space and make it seem like it's innocuous at first, but, look at this side schnoz. You can kind of see. Whoops. Maybe you can kind of see. I don't know.
Toward a more general look at whiteness. He and I also co-edit, along with Julia Round, a book series for University of Nebraska Press on comics theory. So if anyone listening is interested in, submitting to that, please reach out to us. And just now, this hasn't really been announced yet, but in the past few days, we've gotten a contract, another scholar, Karen Omri, and I, to co-edit a book series for Palgrave on major science and text. So a lot going on, a lot in the editing world, but hopefully some more public-focused work about, how we deal with these major issues.
Well, thank you, Sean, for joining me, Professor Latinx podcast, to talk about your co-edited Unstable Masks, Whiteness, and American Superhero Comics. Thank you, Sean.
Just total grifter parasites. But yeah, back to, regular everyday Latino or Hispanic Americans. This study, if you can, on your own time, you can go through it. Pew Research, probably link it in the description later, but shows you that while, a quarter or so, depending on the age demographics, but about a quarter, maybe a little bit more of Latinos in America have heard of the term Latinx, but virtually none of them use it. Like 3% of them. Total fucking nonsense, bougie, leftist nonsense, trying to scramble your brain, scramble your language, subvert your culture, piece by piece. They've been doing it for years. It's just that they've been really bold about it with the advent of social media being ubiquitous. But yeah, once again, if you've got a video you'd like me to go over, or a podcast, whatever, article, please toss me this tier here. DNDo has been gracious enough to toss me some support, and I'm glad to go over whatever you want me to go over, however painful it may be. But yeah, I'm gonna play us out with some more Chrono, chat a little bit.